we go. And so, all right, well, welcome back. We are on session 3 now. It is June the 7th on Tuesday, and time is just flying by. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. I have had a chance to look at all of your discussion threads. So if you'd turned in discussion thread 1, I had a chance to look at those today. I was really pleased that a lot of different kinds of responses. I thought was really, really interesting. Not like there were some people that wrote about similar ideas, but I was really surprised at how there were like at least 20 distinct values or ideas that y'all talked about. It was really interesting. So it's really cool to get like sort of a snapshot of how everybody expresses themselves, how you do expressive writing, how you write just in general. And so I left a little bit of feedback. In the feedback for these discussion threads, I'm not really trying to be critical. I'm not like going to be pointing out like, oh, you don't know anything about comma usage here, or you know that's not what this word means. It's really more just like noticing what you're doing well and lauding you for that, so that I have some kind of point of reference to fall back on whenever we do get to assignments where my comments will be a little bit more critically minded. But you know, I'm not going to tell you like you know, have you considered taking all these words out and putting in new words, right? I'm not trying to insult you. I definitely want you to get better. So I want to have like, you know, I want to point out things that you're doing well, and, you know, strategies for how you could approach other things down the line as well. So it was really good. I really liked all the way it was due, today at noon. And they're going to be every session at noon that there is one. I think there's only one of the discussion thread assignments is technically the research free writing, and then 1 week we don't have a writing due, but basically every other session we're going to have a discussion thread due at noon. And yeah, like I said, I was really pleased with how those all turned out. A lot of really great strategies of definition. A lot of you are using dictionaries, which is really cool. It's going to be every class. So today there was one that'll be one due on Thursday. That'll next Tuesday is going to be the research free writing. Then next Thursday there's no writing due that day, and then basically every week if we have a session that day at noon there's a discussion thread due. So, and it's all laid out. If you go to the calendar on the course Blackboard site, you'll be able to scroll through the months and see like, okay, there's a discussion thread due every day. You'll see all the assignments mapped out like that. But yeah, some good strategies of definition, good uses of compare contrast. I like to see how everybody was really engaging and synthesizing and comparing really well. Some people like throwing out some narrative strategies was really good, sort of like telling me a story that illustrates why the thing is important to you. I think that's really good. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Other things that I noticed, this is really interesting too. Some people have a very objective way of doing expressive writing. I remember though, I can't remember who it was specifically, but there was one response that there were almost no first person statements in the entire response. It was all like an objective third person analysis of the expressive like value, which I thought was really interesting, like to approach an expressive writing in such an analytic fashion. But then in the response to another student, they had first person statements, like I statements, which I thought was really interesting. It's like, wow, it just seems like maybe you have like a very analytic way of engaging with everything, right? At least one person's parent is a lawyer, which I could definitely tell by the way that you like made a case and ended with therefore. I was like, that's a really like a legally minded way of working through almost like an argument in a way, but like at least like some of the language of the expressive writing was argumentative. I thought that was really cool. It's cool to see how people, the kind of language that you use, the kind of like ideas that you have, and the way that you frame those things. So really good. Some people really good at forming paragraphs, right? It's a really good snapshot of like, okay, this is like where your baseline abilities are now. And we can see like where we can go from those. So what we'll do today is, since last time I had a whole bunch of groundwork stuff to cover with the research, and I wanted to like sort of get through a lot of that, we kind of ended up bumping expressive writing and description. So what we'll do in the first hour today is presently I'll turn to expressive writing and description, and we'll talk about those ideas. and then we'll take a break. And then when we come back, I'll pivot to literary writing and narration, and I'll start that off with a discussion of the most popular creative writing note that you'll ever run into, which is show, don't tell. And then we'll talk about all of the readings that you have done so far. So the first part of the class, we'll pivot back to Adichie and Strayed, and then in the second half, we'll talk about Sedaris and Weora. I always say, is it Weora? I can't ever remember. I'm terrible about it. How do we like those readings for today? Did y'all like the This Is Tossing and Us and Them? Any initial thoughts about those?
I really felt like I was in the middle of This Is Tossing.
Yeah, it's really great,
cool.
right? It's almost like a recipe in a way, right? Like the second person is that one of the reasons why I love that, and I'll talk your ear off about point of view today, is that second person is so rarely used. And one of the things I love about that essay is that it's both like a narrative of process, but it's all in the second person. And you so rarely see like a sustained second person like that it has this very interesting and unique effect. Especially if you ever get the chance to read any fiction from the second person, super weird. Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney. Ernie? I can't ever say his last name either. That's probably the most famous example of it. I think, what's her name? What's her name? Atwood? I think Atwood has at least one long novel from sustained second person, or at least maybe some short stories. All right, so that said though, are we able to read these whenever, or are these for upcoming assignments? The things that I'm just talked about are the things we're going to talk about today. The readings for next time are going to be the Pew Research Center reading and I can't remember what the second reading is right now, but I'll talk briefly about that at the end of class before y'all get out of here, and just remind you like where we're going next and what the readings are going to be that we'll talk about next time. So we go. Gallery view going. All right, expressive writing. What is it? What does it want? How can we break it? These purposes slides, I like to lead off with a quote from Purpose Pattern Process, which is this hefty tome. It's a rather large anthology. A lot of different Comp 1 classes use that. It's sort of published by us at ACC. But expressive writing allows us to engage in a process of self-exploration and self-discovery to find out who we are and even perhaps who we are going to be. The dominant feature of all expressive writing is that it reveals the writer's identity and individuality. Everything in an expressive work reflects these perceptions and attitudes unique to the person who created it. Each subject addressed is considered in terms of how it fits into the writer's personal vision of things. And I think you could really see that on display, especially in the Adichie writing and the Strayed writing, but even to a certain extent in the Sedaris writing and Weora, right? There's a little bit of expressive writing going on. It's not mutually exclusive to say that something's expressive or literary. Something that's literary usually has some kind of expressive component to it. Even referential writing can be somewhat expressive. Argumentative writing, persuasive writing can sometimes be really strongly expressively minded because it could be an argument about these ideas, these things that are important to an individual's identity. And so there's some important keywords we'll talk about. Obviously, the idea of expressive writing itself, a very important word called diction, which is a fancy way of saying word choices. Connotations and denotations, sort of two ways of talking about definition. We'll talk about tone, and we'll talk about point of view. So what is expressive writing? Again, it reveals a writer's attitudes, perceptions, personal vision, experience, and values as a form of self-discovery. This is whenever there was a lot of responses in the discussion thread that talked about how writing and therapy are very similarly related, and often there are certain forms of therapy that ask you to engage in journaling and things like that. And it's this idea of self-reflection, that you can grow or learn things about yourself from writing about yourself. And I think that's one of the interesting things about just writing in general, that even if you're not a habitual writer, that seems to be like a source of, in literature, what we would call catharsis, the idea of getting something out, relieving of some kind of tension. Attributes of expressive writing include, and we'll talk about these as individual parts, but expressions of value, self-definition, emotional meaning, and the use of subjective language. And there are different types of expressive writing. Y'all have done like what you're doing with your free writings, or a form of diary or blogging, basically. Blogging is just a new word we've invented for journaling. I don't really understand maybe there's a distinction between blogging and journaling, but it seems like the same activity to me. But autobiography and memoir, especially, two things that I don't know if there's like a really strong distinction between what constitutes a memoir and what constitutes an autobiography. A memoir can be a little bit more fast and loose with the details, I think. Memoirs tend to be a little bit more like novels about someone's life. Kerouac would probably be a memoirist more than a novelist, I would probably say. Yeah, online journaling. Yeah, that would be a good way to like describe what blogging is. Or like, nobody says the word vlogging, but it's like, when you do the action of blogging, when you're emoting in language out loud into a camera, on YouTube. That's also a version of it's maybe we wouldn't call it expressive writing, but expressive content creation, I guess, to create a very inelegant phrase. But yeah, memoirs and autobiographies, individuals writing about their own life, reflecting on their own life, right? Distinct from just regular biographies, where somebody else comes in and writes about you, right? It's a little bit different. Any personal letters. This would also include like cards that you send to people. I don't know how many people are writing letters anymore. That's interesting, if not waning art. Creeds, declarations, and manifestos. These can get very personal, but they could also be like very political, right? Like you could talk about the Communist Manifesto as a form of expressive writing. You could talk about the Declaration of Independence as a form of expressing values about self-evident truths and individuality. Creeds, religious creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, it's offering a statement of identity or fidelity to some kind of idea greater than yourself, right? Those are all just individual examples, but anything that like sort of fits into those genres qualify as personal, right? It's a personal statement of self-identity. It's an expression of your values and your the different emotional meanings that you have with things. And we've already underlined this a little bit. Values are principles, standards, or qualities that individuals and societies consider praiseworthy or desirable. They inform our judgments and our valuations, either moral or otherwise, right? A value judgment could be, this action is immoral. Another value judgment could be that sandwich is disgusting, right? They're not equivalent judgments, but they're employing the same kind of evaluative idea. Again, they can be moral ideas like justice, duty, honor, fairness, or they can be more general ideas like creativity, patience, kindness, right? And I saw a lot of, a good mixture of these in your discussion threads. A lot of people talking about things like self-care, empathy, honor, duty. Well, actually, I don't think I saw honor, but I saw duty and I saw trustworthiness, or the idea of like telling the truth, the quality of being credible. A lot of these things really interwoven with these like sort of inextricably moral ideas, like even in ideas that are a little less like specifically moral, like the idea of family is an important value. I saw that a couple of different times. Very important, right? The people who support you and help you become who you are. And as somebody pointed out, family, a couple of people pointed out, family can be the relations that you're born into. It can be the relations that you choose to surround yourself with, right? All of these are great sources of content for expressions of values. Self-definition. This expresses important or essential qualities about your identity through revelations of your personality. And when we talk a little bit more about description, that's going to be really strongly related to the idea of self-definition. But also, self-definition has a sort of a loose association with the act of defining things in general, right? A self-definition is just one kind of definition, right? In the same way that words have definitions, an act of self-definition is ascribing meaning to yourself, right? Existentially speaking, who am I? What do I, well, at least one person, maybe a few people wrote about authenticity, right? Maybe you're an existentialist and you believe in like very strong statements of becoming who you are. And we'll talk about crafting definitions and how like we can take these tools of self-definition, we can apply it to sort of language in general. When we talk about description here in just a minute. So attributes of self-definition, these examinations of thoughts and feelings, and it's all about what you choose to say. And, this is all about specifics, right? One of the things I do notice in sort of early writings, especially expressive writings, and again, this is like, you're writing for a pretty strange audience right now, right? You don't necessarily know each other. So maybe you're a little bit more or less cagey about what you choose to reveal, right? I can't force you to write about to reveal intimate details, and I wouldn't want to. I one time had a student, instead of writing a personal essay, wrote that basically like, I don't know who you are and I don't feel comfortable sharing things about myself. And I was like, well, that's going to make writing this essay a little bit difficult. Because the prompt was about like, talk about some time that you've like overcome an obstacle. And they did a very creative thing, which was they turned the idea that they had like brought this problem to their mom, and apparently their mom was like, just lie to him. Was he gonna like fact check your life? Is he gonna like, find out who you are? And she was like, well, this is like a moral dilemma for me, because I was like, I don't want to lie, but I also don't want to do a thing that I don't want to do. And I was like, creative, right? I like what you did there. I think it would have been a little bit easier to just like write about a time that you overcame something, but okay, maybe privacy is a value that you hold very close to yourself. But in general, where the rubber really meets the road, where with expressive writing and hooking that into the strategies that are going to be more in play later in the semester, is about being specific, right? Choosing to reveal like some of the more well-formed writings, responses to the discussion thread would talk about general ideas and then give me specific examples of like what informed that idea, right? Some more or less circling around generalities with more generalities, but right, really being specific. Specificity it's the heart of expression, it's the heart of narrative. Whenever we talk about claims and looking at arguments, being specific is going to be really important, right? You don't want to risk overgeneralization because you don't want to like mischaracterize somebody's position, say, or you don't want to like engage in a variety of fallacious or cognitive biases or fallacies or cognitive biases that stem from being ambiguous, right? Good writing is specific writing. In one formulation. And it's all about choices. It's all about what you choose to reveal about the things that inform other things. So, I saw a lot of this in the discussion thread, talking about how past experiences, comparing how you used to see things to how you see things now. That's a really great way to do that. It seemed like sometimes there were some specific experiences that had built or informed your self-identity or your sort of sense of moral or expression now, that maybe you didn't want to get into all the specifics, or maybe you're like, oh, it's only 200 words, I don't want to unpack all this. Some people were pretty liberal with their right. I had a few that were like over 400 words sometimes, which is great. I totally encourage you to elaborate. The more that you can put on the page, the more that you're getting in the habit of pulling out those sometimes difficult insights. But it's also cultural context, right? I saw some writing that responded to how people have moved here from different places, right? Coming from South America, or even coming from different regions of the United States, right? There are certain regionalisms that define, what it means to be Southern, what it means to be from Chicago, what it means to be from the West, right? Or the Southwest, or, what other sort of socio-cultural identities that you belong to, like what sort of cultural identity that helps shape or inform who you are. Specific circumstances, again, right? Socioeconomic conditions, how did you grow up? How does that compare to where you came now? What did you learn through that experience, right? These are all really fertile ground in which to sow the the seeds of expressive writing. Expression of needs and desires, fears, anything that's going to control your attitudes and beliefs, right? Revealing these specific fears, especially if you were to look at the strayed reading, I think in particular does this really well. She see if I can't blow this up just a little bit. She says, this is very close to the beginning, right? That I hadn't written a book by the time I was 29. It was a sad shock to me. Of myself, I'd expected greater things. I was a bit like you then, Alyssa Bassis, without a book, but not entirely without literary acclaim. I won a few grants and awards, published a couple of stories and essays. These minor successes stoked the grandiose ideas I had about what I would achieve and by what age I would achieve it. I read voraciously. I practically memorized the works of writers I loved. I recorded my life copiously and artfully in my journals. I wrote stories in feverish, intermittent bursts, believing they'd miraculously form a novel without my having to suffer too much over it. But I was wrong. The second heart inside me beat ever stronger, but nothing miraculously became a book. As my 30th birthday approached, I realized that I truly wanted to write the story I had to tell. I would have to gather everything within me to make it happen. I would have to sit and think of only one thing longer and harder than I thought possible. I would have to suffer, by which I meant work, right? I think one of the things that Straight is really good at is really engaging in this act of self-analysis and really being vulnerable on a page, right? And when I say to be specific, a lot of the times what I'm really meaning, I think, is being vulnerable, and that's a very difficult thing to do. But what are a general question to you in this short passage? Like, what sort of sense about writing or the importance of writing do you get from the things that she's choosing to reveal here? Like, what kind of sense of her as a person do you get out of this short passage?
She kind of holds her worth in her writing.
Okay, elaborate on that a little bit.
I guess she feels like she's defining success by this one big thing, a book that she has not yet written. And she thinks that she will achieve success through the little things, but since she's so focused on the novel, she's not content with the successes that she has achieved.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway from that, is that like she says, she's not totally without success, but like it's sort of making her, what her criticism of Alyssa becomes is that it's almost like she can see herself, like she can see Alyssa's arrogance as a reflection of like the way that she kind of was arrogant, even when she didn't really realize that she was me, right? Or was then. Words are hard. But like you said, it's something of fundamental importance to her, and you get the sense through this that like even though she has not at one point does she say she doesn't just say the sentence, writing a book was very important to me, right? She shows us how important that is by the agony with which she chooses to express about these things, right? The actions that she goes through, the voracious reading, the like lofty ideas that she has about what success should be without actually engaging in like the maybe the day-to-day necessary work that's required to be an author. And she begins this really great metaphor, which becomes this extended analogy about pulling the second beating heart out of her chest, which is a very visceral metaphor, right? Tell me something is important to you without saying that, right? Oh, well, it is a second living thing inside me that I have pulled out with my own hands. Right? Well, that's pretty powerful, right? And that becomes this through line that she comes back to over and over again. And we'll talk a little bit more about figurative language whenever we talk about narration. Is it narration? I can't remember if it's part of the narration or it's part of the description notes a little bit later. But how that becomes this sort of springboard that she maybe not a springboard, but this constant sort of thing that she's pivoting back to, that this thing is a living thing inside of her. And that's, again, really intimate, really vulnerable. and she's like, we really get a sense of like, how important this is to her through the specific vulnerable details that she's showing. And speaking of specific and vulnerable details, one function of language is to convey information, but many words evoke or express motion. This is kind of sometimes called the distinction between cognitive meaning and emotional meaning, right? All words have a cognitive meaning, right? Cognitive meaning is just a fancy phrase for like the thing that a word means. But an emotional meaning could be really subject to the individual, right? Like, if we were to go back to Strade's language, right? Anybody know what the word voraciously means? What's the cognitive meaning of the word voracious? It's a very fancy word. It's a good word, though.
Like almost hungry?
Yeah, that's a really good definition, actually. It's to do something with like a great appetite and fervor. You could say that the cognitive meaning is I did it with a lot of gusto, right? I did something, wanting something, but it's more than just a desire for something. If you're reading voraciously, you're doing it without ceasing. It is almost obsessive in its habituation. And if you have no relationship with this word, I bet that if you don't know what this word means, you probably have a very low emotional connection to a word like this, right? But if you're Cheryl Strayed, you probably are using this word very specifically, right? Notice that even the context that comes in. It's a very simple sentence. I read voraciously, right? And it conveys a lot of important emotional meaning for her. And it's almost its shortness is where its power lies, right? All the power is in the manner of the reading, right? Like that's all the emotional content that's conveyed there. It's a really good word. It's very specific. It's very like distills a very specific kind of idea very well. And I've got some different examples that we can talk about in terms of comparing cognitive versus emotional meaning. And those are going to flow through this idea of diction, right? Like the word voraciously, it's a conscious choice, right? Diction's a word. It comes from Latin. It's where we get the word. In Latin, it means something like saying or expression or style. It's where in Spanish you get the verb decir. Spanish Romance language, so everything that derives from Latin eventually like ends up somewhere in one of the Romance languages. But diction is just a fancy way of saying what is the individual word choices that an author makes, right? Voraciously is a specific choice that they're making. Why this word and not some other word, right? This word conveys a specific emotional meaning to this individual. And to sort of illustrate this idea, we can talk about definitions in two different ways. So the denotation versus the connotation. This is really similar to the cognitive meaning versus emotional meaning, right? A denotation is like you look a word up and that's what the definition is in the dictionary, right? That's the denotation. It's the literal definition of the word. But connotation refers to your more subtle emotional experience with a particular word, or maybe a set of words, or maybe a whole set of jargon or whatever, what have you. And I think a good couple words to illustrate this distinction is not to go all the way back to the first slide, but to talk about these two words. The words cheap and inexpensive, which are relatively synonymous words, right? If you look up inexpensive in the dictionary, it's really unique in a way. It only has one denotation. There's only one thing that the word inexpensive conveys, and it's the idea that something is cheap or reasonable in price. But if you look up the word cheap has like a different kind of, it's got a whole constellation of meanings around it, right? If I were to say to you, and I am, I got an inexpensive car. What is that? What kind of emotional sense does that convey to you? If I told you my car was inexpensive, what sort of ideas might you have about the car that I have?
I would think that you have like a early 2000 sedan of some sort.
Okay, so an older car, right? Like, or it's something that I didn't get at market value, maybe, right? Do you think that? But if I said I got a cheap car, what would you say? Like, oh, that's a cheap car. What does a cheap car say to you? Or what could a cheap car mean to you?
Poor.
Poor. Yeah, like maybe it says something about me and my ability to evaluate things, right? Oh, his car's cheap. I wouldn't trust his judgment about evaluation things, right? And maybe there's a reason why you got it at such a good deal. Maybe something's wrong with it, right? Cheap has all these other sort of synonyms with it, right? Look at some of these. Some of its denotation is sort of centered on this idea of inferior quality, right? Tawdry, sleazy, stingy, right? All of these words evoke a very specific emotional content with them, right? If I told you that my car was sleazy, that's weird, right? That maybe I own a white panel van with no windows and I live down by the river or something, right? Sleazy is weird, right? Sleazy has a particular moral content to it almost. Tawdry is just like kind of along the lines of being like, I don't want to define it as cheap, but like if something is tawdry, it's sort of gaudy, as opposed to being like a more positive way of talking about something that like some people would say is tawdry is maybe like flashy and tawdry are kind of two sides of the same coin. If something's flashy, it's like, they're sort of vamping a little bit. They're sort of being showing off a little bit. But if something's tawdry, it's like, it's kind of crass, or like the manner about something that people are doing is tawdry, or like, something is wearing could be tawdry. Maybe it's like not aesthetically pleasing, but also being flashy at the same time. But also something cheap can be gained or done with little effort, right? Purchased at a low price, depreciated in value, right? I guess the upshot of what I'm getting at here is that if you hear that something is inexpensive, it doesn't necessarily have that same kind of judgments baked into it that calling something cheap would have, right? But as Patrick pointed out, like inexpensive kind of makes you think cheap, right? Maybe if I said I had an adequately valued car, maybe that would like wash all of the emotional content from the possible connotations. It's just like, okay, you have an adequately valued thing. But to sort of underscore this, like this idea of like extended connotations, these two columns of words are relatively synonymous. We're going to examine a couple of these. If I called something unique, what does unique say to you?
Different,
Normal.
strange.
Different or strange?
I'd say different in a good way.
Different in a good way. I would generally agree with that, right? If I was wearing something and somebody was like, "Oh, what a unique," well, it could be sarcastic, right? Oh, how unique. I think it's a generally positive quality conveyed by the word unique, right? Oh, if something is unique, then it's one of a kind, right? I have a unique piece of memorabilia or something like that. But what if something's weird? What if I have a weird car? Maybe it's that car from Dumb and Dumber. It looks like a big shaggy dog. Maybe I'm driving around in a mystery machine. Maybe it's painted strange colors. There's a guy who lives in my apartment who he has a white Mazda and it is covered in blood splatter. Like as if for a Halloween joke, he literally just covered it in spatters of red and just left it like that, and now just drives around it. And I think that it is a unique but weird car. I would not something I would want for myself, but that's what he wants to do. So go ahead. But I think generally like weird, and you can embrace weirdness, right? You've seen that car driving around? Yeah, it's around. There's a guy with a Jeep who has a long flagpole and Christmas lights all around. I see this guy all over town. He has so much just what is the word I'm looking for? Flair all over his car, that his car is actually weighed down in the back. Like it kind of like just travels at an incline. It's like a 20-degree slope down in the back. It's like probably really messing with the suspension. But right, unique, weird, right? Two different, like if you like something, maybe it's unique. If maybe you're a little bit off put by it, you're gonna call it weird, right? Keep Austin weird, right? That's an example of like embracing weirdness as an essential and positive form of your identity, right? I like the band Ween. Ween really prides itself on the idea of weirdness for weirdness' sake. The flagpole is required for off-roading trails in case you break down. I never see them left on while driving. Oh, wow. I don't know if this guy's taking this car off-road. I cannot underscore how much stuff is piled on top of this car. Like it looks like a yacht on parade, but it's a Jeep. It's wild. Or like you see old pictures of like World War I battleships sailing into San Francisco Bay. That's what this guy's Jeep looks like. It's wild. So and some words I think have like a little bit more of like a strict distinction between good and bad connotations, right? If I said that somebody was frugal, like with their money, say, like, oh, Deborah is a frugal budgeter. What kind of information does that convey about Deborah and her ability to budget? If you're frugal with your money,
I mean, she's a smart spender.
yeah, that's exactly. She's probably making good decisions, allocating her budget really well. What if I called Deborah miserly? Deborah's miserly with her money.
I automatically think selfish.
Yeah,
not willing to part with a penny for
Scrooge
anything.
McDuck.
Yeah.
Exactly, right? Miserly is like inherently negative, right? I can't think of a single situation except as sarcasm where you would use miserly as a positive description of somebody, right? A similar thing happens, I think, with scrawny and thin, right? If something is thin, that's conveying one kind of connotation. But if something is scrawny, like if I told you, like, that's a scrawny tree, kind of sends this message of like, oh, maybe it's undernourished. Maybe it's not receiving the proper nutrients. Maybe it's like the poor Celosa plant that I had to throw out because no matter what I did to it, it just withered and withered and withered until it was no longer just thin, it was scrawny, and then it was dead. And what are you gonna do? Conceited and confident. Those are another two that I think have a pretty strong distinction between them. If I said, Raquel, you're making lots of confident arguments. What would you think about the kinds of arguments that Raquel is making?
Well thought out.
She knows the information well. It's well thought out. She's coming off as inherently credible, right? But what if I said, Raquel's arguments are quite conceited. She's making quite conceited arguments.
I didn't really think that it was just based on only on her opinions.
Right, maybe the confidence is a little bit more like arrogance. It's like, oh, maybe she's coming off as a know-it-all instead of knowledgeable, right? It's a subtle distinction sometimes, but and a lot of this is going to go to the context, the tone, the word choice that they're using, right? The way that they're characterizing other things and like describing things in language, right? Which, not to belabor it too much, but right, I think you can well see that, like, there's different shades of meaning that you're conveying with different synonyms, even things that are roughly mean, they have maybe an equivalent cognitive meaning can come off with a different emotional meaning to you, to other people, and, as far as like presenting yourself and being perceived. Which is a good pivot into the idea of subjective language, which reveals your personal relationship with words. It's about the individual word choices you make, right? It's about diction, it's about specific word choices, but it's also about tone, which is the quality that language evokes in you, and the quality of of how the author feels about the subject, right? Right. If I went to, say, a stand-up comedy gig, right? I'm going to see comedy, right? I'm expecting a certain kind of tone, right? I'm expecting a certain irreverence. I'm not taking things too seriously, right? If I go to a funeral and I see a stand-up comedian give the eulogy, not everybody's probably going to appreciate that, right? Because maybe they see the tone is not appropriate to the occasion, right? The way the irreverence isn't appropriate in a more somber kind of location. So the context is going to depend on the context and the tone are strongly related, not just the words that you're choosing, but the manner with which you're delivering those words. Dialect and idiolect. We'll talk a little bit about these ideas, big fancy words for not too big fancy concepts. And point of view is going to be really important, especially when talking about descriptive or expressive writing and all kinds of writing, really. Tone, I already sort of alluded to this a little bit, but it reveals the author's attitude towards the subject. It's also kind of the quality, it's really related to this other idea called the mood or the atmosphere. You can even call it the vibe of a particular piece of writing. It's what you feel like reading the thing, right? The impression that the language is giving off on you. If you read something and you're like, oh, what a conceited writer, or oh, what a knowledgeable, credible person, right? That's all really related to the tone that somebody is giving off. Whenever, and this is why I wanted y'all to watch Adichie, because watching someone deliver a piece of oratory is very evocative of their tone, right? You can see her shifting her tone, that she's generally very serious minded, but also has these moments of levity and humor. And I think her moments of humor work really well because she's so serious so much of the time. It's almost like you're not expecting it. And then it's almost like a well-skilled boxer that you don't expect a joke. And then here comes like a very incisive, witty piece of humor or something like that. And I think that's shifting that tone can be, you do it too much, maybe it's disorienting. You do it just the right time, then it can be a very effective way to drive home a point. And so shifting tone can be conveyed in writing through the sentence length, shifting from long to short sentences, right? Longer sentences are conveying a lot of information. Short sentences convey a little bit of information, right? Varying your sentence length. Saying a lot sometimes is very useful. Sometimes, I only have so much bandwidth that I can attach to a particular string of language, right? Sometimes saying less is effective, or just changing it up a little bit, understanding your reader has an attention span, and like keeping them engaged by varying your sentence length, shifting your sentence length, and understanding how that's related to your tone. Using exclamations or other kinds of non-standard punctuation, or just any kinds of punctuation, really. Like, whenever we speak in like ordinary language, we convey questions. You can use question words, but often what's another effective way of turning what is otherwise just a regular sentence into a question? Sometimes a sentence can be a question. Okay, that was an example. It was supposed to be, you modulate the tone of your voice, right? If you say a sentence in a particular way, right, you don't have to necessarily say who, what, where, when, why, or the classic question words, right? You can, affect the idea, you can communicate the idea that you're asking a question simply through the tone of which you're asking something, right? Same thing with exclamations, right? In writing, you'll never do this in academic writing, but if you want to convey the idea that you're shouting at somebody, you do it in all caps. Avoid doing that in writing, right? Because capitalization implies importance, right? That's what it communicates. Exclamations, right, like can affect the sense and tone of, the point that you're trying to make. And when we talk about logic, that's going to be really important, because strictly speaking, sentences that are punctuated with question marks and exclamation points, logic has nothing to say about those. They're actually not what we call truth functional. An exclamation doesn't have a truth value. It can't be true or false. So like an exclamation, strictly speaking, is not part of a formal argument, even though writers use them all the time to make strongly emotional points. An exclamation point is inherently emotionally charged language. So logic does not deal with emotion. So logic does not have anything to say about an exclamation except that it can't be true or false. using connotations in emotionally charged language. Shifting points of view also is related to your tone. Shifting from the first into the second person. This is something that I think is really effectively conveyed by the Strayed reading, where whenever you read this, right, there's a lot of, notice how many, like if I were to just do a control F on I, look how many times she uses the first person pronoun, right? Almost every sentence is some personal expressive statement, right? I was this, I had this, I would do this, I read this, I was wrong, I realized, I thought, I suffered, I bitterly lambasted, right? What a phrase, right? Right? Like I didn't criticize myself. I bitterly lambasted myself, right? This is very specific kind of content conveyed through that. But this idea of like, right, all these like first person statements, these are very revealing. They're very confessional. The tone of first person sentences like this is very intimate. And often whenever we shift between first and second person, these you statements, which see if I can control F the you statements, which I can't see the little control F box. 142 of these, right? Let's get just to the ones that she's using, right? This switch between I was a bit like you, right? And then she goes down, I thought a lot about the same things about myself that you do, to write as you say, right? Like, notice how it creates this conversationality with it, right? It's like she's speaking only to Alyssa Bassist, right? And it creates this very conversational, very intimate tone where it's just creating a conversation. It's a dialogue between two people. It's very intimate. It's very revealing. And which is very interesting. At least one of the student responses for the discussion thread was all written in the third person. I was like, what a depersonalized way to express yourself. The third person is this very objective, very academic kind of tone where we state facts in the third person, right? The first person is not really for stating facts, right? I wouldn't say like, if you state a fact in the first person, it sort of gives it a little sense of conditionality, like maybe it's not true, or like, I believe that, or I think that, or something like that, right? You're saying, you're expressing beliefs, but there's this inherent instability to beliefs, right? Beliefs can be wrong, beliefs can be changed. The third person is a much more commanding and authoritative kind of point of view. And that's why the second person, I think, is so weird, because it's like kind of in between. It's like some disembodied voice is just telling you what you're doing, which is really weird, right? It's like you're being ordered around, which is related to the verbal mood, right? We issue commands from the second person. If you ever read a recipe, the recipe, anything that has instructions is written in the second person, right? Because it's ordering you to do stuff. It's telling you do this, now do that, now do this. As a narrative strategy, it's really disorienting because now you're a character. You're not reading about characters. You are the character that is being addressed by the narrative. Dialect and idiolect, these are two big fancy words that refer to just the way that you use language. Dialect refers to the variations in standard grammar and punctuation associated with a speaking community, right? Like when people talk about a particular like Southern dialect, they're talking about a manner in which people pronounce certain vowels, right? The laziness of the Southern O, you could say, or something like that. Or even coming from, the Northeast, I think has a very, like a Boston accent has a very specific kind of dialect rules associated with it. You hear Mark Wahlberg talk, you know where he's coming from. Right, and it could be like, these could vary wildly even within a region, right? Anybody ever heard been to backwoods Louisiana? Not even really backwoods. Like you go to some like just parts of New Orleans. You hear people speaking like a really strong Creole, like a sort of a heavily Acadian French sort of pidgin like mashup between like sort of some French elements and English elements, and then also a lot more non-standard elements. I know, I'm getting very animated. The dog is excited. Idiolect just refers to your distinctive patterns of speech, right? Idiolect is like, the way that you use language is kind of like a fingerprint. There are certain kinds of cliches that you use, and that are kind of, even though they're cliches. Oh, nice. They're, even though cliches are sort of popularly used, like there's a way that you use them that is kind of unique or weird to you could say, right? One of my favorite stories about Idiolect is from about the Unabomber. If you know who the Unabomber is, for about 20 or 30 years, there was a guy living in the woods mailing bombs to people, and he wrote a manifesto, and the manifesto was called, I think it's like Technical Society and Its Downfall or something like that. And it was all about like how technology is destroying society. And he used a phrase, and the phrase that he used was, one cannot eat their cake and have it too, which is I think maybe you've heard that before, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too, is maybe the version that you've heard. But somebody read that it happened that like, Kaczynski's brother got a hold of that passage and was like, oh, that's weird. I've only ever heard my dad say this phrase in this way. I haven't seen, my brother has a cabin in the woods and he hates technology. Maybe the FBI should go look into him. And it turns out that the Unabomber was caught in large part due to his use of language, which is fascinating to me as a person who's like really interested in the language. Point of view. This is the perspective from which something is told or written. Like I said, first person is indicative of an expressive point of view. Every sentence has a point of view, whether it's written from the first, second, or third person. You can't use language without having it be from a point of view. And when I say point of view, I often mean the grammatical point of view, right? Is it the first person? Is it an I statement? Is it the second person? Is it a you statement? Is it the third person? Is it something that uses more objective language, right? And I think that that distinction between those is very stark whenever you read something like Adichie and Strayed, especially Strayed, who's very much making lots of I statements, lots of first person statements. And then Wewaria is making lots of you statements, right? Almost everything in Wewaria is a you statement. You get these like odd, oh, thought I had him called up. Right. You have always failed to have 11 by 11. Sometimes you fail because you went to bed after midnight and didn't have a bowl of cereal in the morning, or you tear a pie and you're already down one and you don't believe you can ever be anywhere near perfect. On those days, the store manager comes over and inspects your not yet full pie rack and shakes his head, right? All of these are second person statements, right? Whenever you see that second person as a pronoun, it might not mean that the sentence itself is written from the second person, but it means that you've shifted maybe from a point of view to use the second person pronoun. These have a very different effect than third person statements. Even in something like David Sedaris is using like this combination of first and third person statements, right? When my family first moved to North Carolina, we lived in a rented house 3 blocks from the school where I would begin 3rd grade, right? This is, moving from the plural first person we to the singular first person I. Then down here, my mother made friends with one of the neighbors, but one seemed enough for her, right? Here's a third person sentence, right? It's my mother, right? My mother is our subject here. And then, we've got our third person pronoun her there, right? Within a year, we would move again, right? You see this shifting from the first person to the third person. And this is like, I think Sedaris is the reading that is the most strongly like narrative that we encountered. And whenever you read these kind of first person narrative literary kind of essays, that it does kind of read like a novel, and it's got that sort of novel, like, you're making statements about yourself, but you're also doing like world building and describing other characters. And there's other things that you're doing that, Strayed isn't necessarily having to do all that, right? Strayed doesn't have to tell you about anybody but herself and the things that are important to her. That's what this is all about, right? So there's not a lot of like third person stuff going on in Strayed's writing. Whenever you do whenever we move into more referential writing, whenever you do argumentative writing and you do more research minded stuff, you're going to be sort of sterilized in the sense that you're going to be making mostly third person kinds of sentences, and you're not going to be doing a lot of shifting points of view. You're not going to be moving too much into the first person. You're never going to use the second person, for instance. So cultivating an awareness of those ideas is really important. I've got some ideas I've sort of touched on about here. You know, the first person, the big idea here is that it's very intimate. It's very almost confessional at points. Second person, like I said, it's used pretty infrequently. It's almost got this sort of alienating quality where it's like the narrative voice is speaking to you as a reader and you're becoming a character in the story. And then you've got the third person, which is sort of establishes a formal distance. The third person is it's putting on the business formal clothes of your writing tone, whereas the first and second person tend to be more informal and a little bit more attached to spoken language more than they are pitched writing language or like artificial writing. The idea of the situation of I'm a formal person making formal statements. On that note, that takes us to 7 o'clock. Let's take a brief moment. We'll take 10, and then when we come back, we'll tie everything up. And we'll talk about the literary purpose, and then we'll talk about description and narration, and I'll bore down a little bit more on the idea of showing versus telling. But y'all go ahead and take a break, and we'll reconvene at, let's call it 7:10. All right. Okay, welcome back. The dog is fed, and I'll go ahead and since we ended on expressive purpose, just plow right into literary purpose. And since the patterns of development are really not particular to one kind of purpose, we'll talk about those together separately right after this. So we'll go ahead, since we're all getting worked up about purpose in writing, let's talk about a literary purpose. Again, from purpose, pattern, and process, we listen to music we like over and over. We may go back to see again a movie we especially enjoyed. We hang paintings or posters on our walls and look at them, or at least see them almost every day. So it is with literary writing. It is the arrangement of words in literary writing that appeals to our aesthetic sensibilities. The literary structures created by the various combinations of words and images pleases us when we read them. I got a girl I work with will not stop talking about the movie Morbius. She went and saw it like 3 times, and now she only says that it's Morbin time. That's like all she does now. So I've had to come up with like creative Morbius analogies and puns in order to get her to do anything at work. But the idea that we come back to literary writing is something that invests us, right? You listen to the same albums over and over again. So it is with literary writing, whether it's literary fiction or if it's nonfiction. And I think you can see that there's, once we unpack some of these ideas, something like Sedaris. Sedaris has a literary purpose. He's trying to tell us a story. It's awful. I've heard Morbius is very bad, but I don't know. People are allowed to like bad art too. But the purpose that he's doing is telling you a story, and that's really the heart of literary writing, is storytelling, right? Whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And that's where it's a little bit different from the purpose being expressive. And you can see also that these purposes can inhabit the same body, right? The same text can have an expressive and a literary purpose, right? Sedaris, he's making lots of I statements, he's revealing personal things about himself, right? There's an expressive purpose that's at work there. But we would call that writing literary writing because its primary goal is to tell us a story. And that's really where the rubber meets the road with literary writing. So what is it? It creates an aesthetic, artistic, and imaginative or pleasing experience with language. And I kind of alluded to this. Traditionally, we make a distinction in literary writing between poetry and prose. Poetry, we could make a distinction between fictional and non-fictional poetry, although I don't think a poet would make such a distinction. They would probably like laugh at me for being like overly analytic about something that is so emotionally expressive. But poetry is highly symbolic language. Often poetry is arranged in a very particular form, although modern poetry, anything could be modern poetry. But traditionally poetry is formal poetry, or at least part of poetry can be formal. The sonnet is probably the most readily identifiable form of poetry that you might have heard about. There's a lot of different forms of the poem. There's the villanelle, there's the haiku, there's the limerick, right? There's lots of different forms of poetry, but poetry takes words and it kind of arranges them cosmetically on a page, and it usually invests each individual word and phrase with an inordinate amount of meaning, right? There's a little highly symbolic. It's almost like more like painting than it is like essay composition or something like that. Poetry can be storytelling too, but the main distinction between poetry and prose is that prose is generally pretty formally organized. It aims to mimic ordinary speech or some close approximation of how we use ordinary grammar, or ordinary language. We use standard grammar when we're writing in prose. We generally sort of wrestle it into the sentence and paragraph form. But all these conventions, right? You can, poetry doesn't have to follow any rules if it doesn't want to. It can throw all the rules of grammar out the window, whether it knows them or cares about them or not. Usually poets don't really care about grammar. Some of them very much do, but a lot of them could probably take or leave grammar. Literary prose distinguishes itself from other types of writing through its similarity with fiction. Literary prose uses narrative, narration, conflict, theme, and figurative language. So to call prose literary suggests a dramatic and storytelling style, right? And there's definitely elements you can see in Adichie. She's telling you lots of stories, right? It's not one coherent, sustained narrative exactly. There's a through line through a lot of the stories she's telling you, and that through line, a lot of to her is power, the power that individual stories have. But it's nothing like the sustained narrative that Sedaris is telling you, for example, or even Oria, who is sort of telling us a story, but it's really more just like almost instructions at the same time, right? It's a very different kind of story. There's a tension, right? There's conflict, but it's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit more of like it's an internal conflict. We'll talk about some different kinds of conflicts too. One of the things that emerges from the story is a theme. It's a unified idea that arises from the elements of a narrative. A theme is often not explicitly stated by the author, right? When I talk about themes, I'm more talking about what people who analyze texts distill as a theme statement, right? Like if I were to ask you what's the theme of the story, it's a sentence that you would write that describes what you think is like the unifying idea in the story, right? So for example, in Sedaris, you could say that the theme is something like television makes people superficial and unable to communicate or can emotionally connect with people. If I was talking about a theme from something out of Oria, it is doing something perfectly, even small, can have profound emotional meaning for somebody, right? Like it's how all the different elements of the thing work together to sort of reinforce or support a central idea, right? And we look at different elements, and whenever we're doing it in fiction, we would call them the elements of fiction, but they're pretty conversant with nonfiction too. We look at things like dialogue, characterization, conflict. We can look at elements of the plot. We can look at figurative language, like what are these metaphors doing? What is the content of these similes? What kind of extended analogies are we using? Are they using irony a lot? Those are the things we call like rhetorical devices or figurative language, or sometimes aesthetic language, right? We'll look at some of the more important ones. Importantly, a theme statement is expressed in a single sentence. And I have a couple of thoughts about that. By distinguishing theme from a couple of related ideas of what a theme is not. 3 ideas that we'll talk about real quick. Is important as a writer to know your theme before you write something? Absolutely not. I don't think so. Sometimes I think the theme might be the last thing. If, when you're writing nonfiction, you might have a more general sense of the theme as you write. When you're writing fiction, I don't think you're actually concerned with theme really at all, in a way. Tom Clancy has this famous quote where somebody asked him, like, what are the themes of your writing? And he said something like, themes are for English high school teachers. I write books about people that do things. Which I know, like, it's incredibly offensive. But he does have sort of a point, right? Like, the act of creating fiction, you're less concerned with like it's more of like a revising and editing thing when you're going back. Like, how am I knitting the things together? Writing fiction is more like a collage, whereas writing nonfiction is a little bit more like building a scaffolding, I guess you could say, or building a building or something like that. But themes, topics, and morals. 3 ideas that are somewhat related, but not synonymous. A simple distinction between a theme as a topic is that a theme is composed of many topics. A theme is like a generalization. A topic is something specific. So, a theme, like if I were to go back about, talking about one of the themes of Sedaris's story, Us and Them, is that television makes people superficial and like kills emotional connections between people. One of the topics that supports that theme is the idea of television, or owning or not owning a television, right? One is a topic, one is a theme. And I have this kind of example that I hope expresses what I'm trying to get at here. If I say that a theme is a complete sentence, right? Sometimes when I ask people about themes, they'll give me a sentence like this: the theme is addiction. And by my definition, this is a complete thought, right? This is a sentence that expresses the theme. But really, I think what's happening here is we've got this verb is, which is a verb of definition. And all we're really saying here is that what is the theme? The theme is this one topic, right? It's just the topic of addiction, right? But if I were to make a more robust theme-like statement, it would be something more like this. The story suggests the theme that addiction has the power to destroy lives, right? It's this tell me what it's doing part that I think distinguishes less developed theme statements from more developed theme statements. And this distinction might become a little bit more apparent to you whenever you're doing thesis statements, because a thesis statement is kind of the same thing, right? Like the author suggests that, you know, what does the author's argument produce, right? The author is going to be saying thing more than just like one specific topic. The author is going to have an overall conclusion that they're getting at. So, right, like it's not even that this isn't a theme statement. It's just, I think that you could workshop and revise that to push that a little further. What insight are you trying to make? What is the thing saying about these topics or this specific topic? And getting to something a little bit more like this, like what is this topic? What is it doing? How is it working with other topics in the work? And this doesn't come from anything specific. This is just a sentence I thought up. So this isn't related to like Sedaris or anything like that. Sometimes students, especially when you're doing analysis of fiction, which if any of you go on to Comp 2, this distinction is going to be a lot more readily apparent. This distinction between a theme and a moral. A moral is like an imperative. It's like a moral imperative to do or to not do something. It's how people should or shouldn't act, right? In Aesop's fable of The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the moral is, does anybody remember that story off the top of your head? What's the moral of The Boy Who Cried Wolf?
When you're constantly untrustworthy, people will not come to you when you actually have a need.
Right. You could say that the moral is something like don't lie, right? People shouldn't lie. People should always tell the truth, right? Which is different from a theme, right? A theme doesn't give you like guidance on acting, right? A theme of that story you could say is in Aesop's The Boy Who Cried Wolf, the theme of dishonesty leads to terrible consequences is present in that story, right? Like that's not telling you don't lie. It's just saying that there is an idea that is sort of floating around through all of these different elements of the story. So like, I often see morals and themes kind of confused. And so I think it's important to distinguish between this idea of a theme and a moral and a topic, especially a topic and a theme. Is you'll be engaging with the distinction between a thesis statement and a topic pretty soon. A conflict, sometimes also called a tension. It's an opposition or a struggle that heightens and intensifies as the plot moves forward. And this could be something very simple. It could be something incredibly complicated. I like the word tension almost a little bit better than conflict, because tension just describes like forces sort of locked in opposition, or not even maybe necessarily opposition, but some sort of like, I guess opposition is probably the best word to use there, because conflict, I think, kind of has this connotation of like, oh, the people are physically fighting, but whereas a tension is more of like just this kind of like more of like a tautness, right? Almost like a rope can have a tension in it, like a knot or something like that. Whereas it's like, it's not like one side of the rope is trying to defeat the other side, right? All conflict is not necessarily adversarial. Some conflict is productive. Some tension is good tension, right? And so there's a couple of different ways that we can think about tension. The struggle within the self, the internal struggle, right, is where you struggle, characters struggle with psychological, have sort of psychological problems, right? Think about, you know, Sedaris struggling internally over, you know, whether or not he's going, like which candy he's going to like keep for himself, right? He's having this psychological stress. In Weewarrior, he's struggling against his sense of perfection, right? He's got this abstract ideal that he's always constantly worried that, like, am I good enough? Am I going to be? And then once he achieves perfection, he's still got tension. Now he can't ever achieve. Now he can't ever aim at something greater, right? Once you achieve perfection, well, where do you go from there, right? So the new tension that he opens up at the end. The struggle against another. This is kind of a classic conflict, like two characters pitted against each other, physically, emotionally, or whatnot, right? This is, protagonist versus antagonist. This is Harry Potter versus He Who Should Not Be Named. This is Captain Kirk and Khan. It's a very dated reference, maybe not Toby, but this, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, right? This is opposing struggles against each other. The struggle against society, characters struggling against certain social expectations or against society in a whole. Think dystopian fiction, right? Her name immediately escapes me. The character in the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen. She's struggling against her society, the things that are expected of her. She's expected to act a certain way in the Hunger Games, and she immediately sort of shakes off those expectations, and that becomes a big focal point for her narrative arc in that story. In Us Versus Them, you've got Mr. Tompkins' family doesn't own a television, right? This causes profound distress among people, and almost like inspires his neighbors into like all this kind of conspiratorial thinking. Like, what does he do if he's not watching TV? What horrible beliefs is it? What other horrible things is he forcing on his family? And so there's this sense of that he's violating social expectations in some way. And then the struggle against nature. This is like man versus the awesome forces of nature, right? That the writing of Ernest Hemingway, for example, climbing mountains, jumping out of helicopters and things like that. I don't know if Hemingway ever wrote a story about jumping out of a helicopter, but that sort of thing, right? The perfect storm, right? Where I forget the guy's name, but whoever George Clooney's character was in that, man versus tidal wave, like those sorts of naturally ennobling struggles, like stories about hunts, things like that. Another way of looking at these is sort of organize them into three kinds of categories: psychological tension, physical tension, and social tension. Struggles within the self, physical tension, between external characters or between a character and nature could be physical tension. Social tension, this is, people struggling versus others in society, certain social expectations. Just a different way of conceiving the same ideas, which I honestly probably find this way of looking at conflict a little bit more illuminating than these are like sort of a classical kind of fiction way to look at conflict, but I think this is really useful in terms of like nonfiction. Verisimilitude is a big fancy word that just means how is it like truth. It literally means like truth. Vere from the Latin word for truth, similus from the Latin for similar to, and tude is just a thing we put on the end of stuff that we took from Latin and turned into adjectives. Verisimilitude, or nouns, I guess. Verisimilitude. Yeah, it literally means like truthiness. And so this quality of writing is what is the author doing to replicate the intricacies and the realities of life, right? How are they using dialogue? How are they giving you well-formed, round characters, right? Instead of just stereotypes, we're getting characters that have like deep inner lives, that are actual characters on a page, right? You're not just like throwing out a bunch of like very wooden, one-dimensional characters. How are they describing settings in such a way that make them come to life, using vivid details, specific details, right? And so like literary writing really traffics in this idea of creating high degrees of verisimilitude. Not really a big concern for expressive writing, you could say, right? Cheryl Strayed is not really engaged in creating like a strong sense of verisimilitude, right? She's not like doing world building. She's not, talking about setting or really engaging in a lot of descriptive language that isn't about her own personal feelings and expressions, right? That might be a kind of verisimilitude. But in terms of like Sedaris, we're talking about like the way that he's describing certain like, creeping into the bushes, the way that he gives us characters speaking in dialogue. I think a really great example of this is the exchange that Sedaris's mother has with the lady who brings her okra. It's the exchange that his parents have after the lady brings her okra. She says, To say that you did not believe in television was different from saying that you did not care for it. Belief implied that television had a master plan and that you were against it. It also suggested that you thought too much. When my mother reported that Mr. Tomke did not believe in television, my father said, "Well, good for him. I don't know if I believe in it either." "That's exactly how I feel," my mother said. And then my parents watched the news and whatever came on after the news. This is like it seems deceptively simple, right? But like you've got a lot of those ideas, I think, that are packed into that theme statement. You've got this sense of like people being very superficial, right? Saying one thing and acting in a different way, people being hypocritical. You've got this idea of like throwing out these like dialogue phrases, right? "That's exactly how I feel." "Well, good for him. I don't know if I believe in it either," right? Like these ways of like creating characters that have like points of view, and then, you know, we can judge them objectively based on, you know, whether or not their actions comport with the things that they believe. Interestingly, does anybody know what this rhetorical device is that he's setting up here when he says that when the mother says, you know, the father says, "I don't know if I believe in television," and the mother says, "I don't believe in television," and then they just go on and watch television? What would you? We'll come back to it. I would call this a version of irony, right? We're setting up, you know, expectations for one thing. You know, if you say that "I don't think I believe in television," and then you go ahead and watch television, that's pretty revealing that you're being hypocritical. That's ironic, right? Being hypocritical is ironic. You're setting up expectations to behave in one way, but you're actually behaving in a different way. So what I would call situational irony. There's a little bit of situational irony. It's a little bit of verbal irony too, because we've got dialogue. Back to, here we go. Which is a nice segue into figurative language. And this refers to authors' creative use of rhetorical devices. These are things like imagery, symbolism, similes, metaphors, analogy, irony. There's a lot more. I'm only going to highlight, you know, a small handful of what I think are really important ones that you're going to see pretty often, that if you're aware of what they look like and where they are, you'll be able to notice when authors are just kind of using creative language, especially whenever we talk about argument, you know, distinguishing between the actual claims of an argument and just writers using language in like an artful way. It's a very important thing to be able to distinguish. There are hundreds of rhetorical figures. There's a whole website, there's many websites dedicated, but there's one in particular that, I mean, just the list of figures alone, there's over 100 rhetorical figures. I'm only gonna talk about like 6. So, you know, if you can understand these 6, that'll lead you to all the other ones. The heart of figurative language is making comparisons. Like, in a way, all figurative language is analogy. And it's all just like kind of different species of analogy. Imagery, this refers to the mental images evoked in the reader through the writer's use of descriptive languages. So writers use descriptive language and they're appealing to the senses, right? And there's a lot of like very high dollar adjectives here, gustatory imagery when you're talking about appealing to how something tastes, using descriptive language about taste, how something feels, right? Using lots of different descriptive adjectives about, you know, the way that something feels, right? Its tactile sensation. Sight, right? This is probably the one that we use most, like sort of favoring more than any of the others, is like describing how a thing looks. Physical description, whenever we talk about developing content through description. The way sound and smell, these are a little bit less used. I used to have a writing, if you ever get a chance to read Anthony Bourdain, I highly recommend it. He's a very descriptive writer. But if you want like sort of a masterclass in how to describe how things smell and taste, read Anthony Bourdain. He's very, very good at describing things. He's a chef, or was a chef, if you are unfamiliar with the guy. Reading creative nonfiction written by chefs is really awesome. Really, I highly recommend it. Kitchen Confidential is very readable. But you know, how are authors using language to describe certain sensual experiences, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about imagery. Symbolism. A symbolism is very similar to a metaphor. It's when a word or something stands for more than just its literal meaning. Some examples of this, whenever you see, and this is very like the visual grammar of film is probably the most readily intelligible way to communicate this. Whenever you see fire is often a symbol of like intense passion, rage, love, right? All of these kinds of different ideas. It doesn't always mean these things. It doesn't always mean any one of these things. Sometimes it can mean all of these things. But it's the idea that if something you see something and it's like serving more than one purpose, right? It's not just a fire. There's like some like greater thematic content involved with it. Water is often a symbol for purification. You know, you read religious texts, you see a lot of, like, for example, in the New Testament, there's a lot of water in the New Testament. There's a lot of relationship between the purifying power of water and miraculous deeds happening, right? That's water as a symbolism, right? Water is a symbol for something more than just a thing that you drink to stay alive, right? It's not just physical nourishment, it's spiritual nourishment, right? That's really the upshot of symbolism. It's when something stands for more than itself. Symbols can have distinct cultural meanings, which can vary dramatically according to context, right? Just because something means has certain symbolic meaning in one context doesn't mean that's going to translate particularly well into another cultural context. Similes, this is probably the most basic kind of comparison you can make. It's an indirect comparison using like or as. Usually you're going to see like and as in a simile. Sometimes just grammatically, those structure words might be omitted. But generally speaking, when you see something, you know, X is like Y, you know, you're looking at a simile. And it's kind of a weaker comparison than something like a metaphor, whereas a metaphor, you're saying something is something else, right? And a good distinction between these two is if you're looking at Wevoria, especially toward the end down here, he's got some really good metaphorical language. Where he's talking about taking the dough and draping it over his arms. He says, right here, you drape the dough over your left forearm like a dish rag. No, not a dish rag. That's too much like a waiter, and you're so much more than that. You think, how many people in the world know how to do something so particular? You're not even in the restaurant when you toss. You're elsewhere. It's you and the dough, like matador and bull. You can imagine the flap of dough like a cape. And since you imagine the dough to be a cape, you can imagine the rest of it all as sport too. And the dough hangs down, slung low, where your right hand cups the heaviest, lowest edge. Your left hand will spring out, and your entire arm will straighten, and your shoulder locks, then your elbow, then your wrist, so that your arm shoots out like a discus thrower's. Right? We got some really specific similes there, right? We've got one simile, dough like a dish rag. We've got no, it's like a matador bull. And then at the end, it's like a discus thrower. Like, what is this? And this is a general question for you, right? If why do you think he, you know, aside from the fact that it's too much like a waiter, we can talk about that. But like, you know, what's the difference between comparing the dough to a dish rag versus comparing it to a matador or a discus thrower? What's the difference in those comparisons? Like, what does it communicate to you about the importance that he attaches to this dough? Well, don't everybody else speak at once. I'm just kidding. I mean, think about it. What's a dish rag? Like, if I were to say something like a dish rag, like, how do you feel about your dish rags? Where are your dish rags right now? Katie's shaking her head. Are you taking your dish rags to a fancy dinner? Are you framing your dish rags and hanging them up above your desk? Right. Like, dish rags are treated. How do we treat a dish rag?
Like a tool.
Yeah.
Not like a tool like the description of a person, but is a tool since there's a purpose to clean stuff.
Yeah, and like anything could be a dish rag, right? Like anything close at hand that generally mops up liquid, I could probably use that I could probably describe that as a functional dish rag, right? But think about how like much significance he's imbuing in the act of tossing and how much the dough means to him. To compare it to a mere dish rag, that's insulting in a way, right? That makes him like a waiter. How do you think he feels about waiters?
Doesn't have too high of a standard of them.
Yeah, waiters are just wait. What's a waiter doing? Oh, he's bringing you food. big deal. Like how hard is it to carry a tray? It's actually quite difficult. As a former waiter, I do take a little bit of offense at his characterization of dish rags and waiters. But a dish rag is it's something that you wipe your hands off with. It's dirty. It's sort of it's a symbol of dirtiness, you could say. Whereas what about Matador and Bull? And you might have very specific feelings about the act of murdering a bull for sport, but there's a different, we're in a different sort of a realm of importance there, right? Like think about the contest between what's going on between Matador and Bull. What kind of conflict do we have here?
There's a lot of energy between Matador and Bull, and there's a sense of danger.
Yes.
You can get really hurt.
Yeah, no, that's the stakes are totally different, right? I'm handling a dish rag. What's that, right? A dish rag is a dish rag. It's a dirty piece of cloth that you're hanging around with. But now I'm saying that it's like fighting a bull, right? There's something. This is a struggle of man versus nature, right? This is like there are real and dangerous stakes. It's an important thing that he is doing, right? It's not just a guy handling something that's like a dish rag. It's like I'm fighting a bull, right? It's like I'm doing something inherently more important than the activity itself, right? He's elevating the importance of the action by using this comparison between Matador and Bull. And then at the end, like a discus thrower, right? Like what do you think of when you think of discus throwers? As compared to say dish rags.
I'm not sure what a discus thrower is.
Oh, discus is, anybody know what a discus? Strong. That was a long time ago in high school where I threw discuses. They're these little plates. They're a little like sort of flying saucer shaped little plate. They weigh like, I don't know, 5 to 10 pounds. You spin around and you throw it real far. Yeah, it's an Olympic sport. In the same way that there's like some real sporty stakes between Matador and Bull, right? And like Kylie's saying, discus throwers are strong. Like you ever see Greek statues? There's a famous Greek statue called the discus thrower. He's the perfect male form, and he's like in mid throw with a discus, right? So he's like invoking this symbolism of like ideal like physical strength and prowess, right? He's trying again. He's using similes to elevate the act of tossing pizza dough into something much greater than it actually is, right? He sees it in much loftier terms, and he's bringing us out of that by actually throwing out this immediate comparison. So like, you hang it like a dish rag. No, not like that. That's not important enough. It's like fighting a bull. No, it's like throwing a discus, right? And so like through the use of similes, you start to see that the importance of the action, the importance of that he's attaching to it becomes more and more important as well. And then by the end, he's like sort of elaborating on this sports imagery a little bit more, where he calls it, you've almost played a perfect game. 11 by 11. Again, he's conceiving of this action of tossing pizza dough in sports terms. Any baseball watchers know what is a perfect game? If you were describing baseball for dummies. But you don't have to give me like I'm not gonna like call ESPN on you if you can't define what a perfect game is. Suffice to say, a perfect game is a thing that does not happen very often, and it's very important when it does, right? It's like just one of the things in the sport of baseball as a pitcher. It's like one of the highest honors you can do is throw a perfect game, throw a no-hitter, right? These are things that don't happen particularly often. And again, he's making that comparison. He's never before been able to, get all of his pizzas ready in the 1 hour that he's been given. He describes it as like this impossible task. But here he is now at the end of the hour, and he's throwing a perfect game, right? He's 10 out of 11, and he's got the 11th one spinning on top of his head right before it ends, right? So he's almost achieved perfection itself. It's really important, right? There's real motivating stakes here. Stakes, not like the food, which is a different kind of food. And so metaphor makes a much stronger comparison, right? Those are like sort of like a little bit weaker comparisons. Metaphor is defining one thing in terms of another. It's saying that one thing literally kind of is another thing. And think about whenever he says, go back to what he says down here, whenever he's the pizza dough spinning above his head and he's sort of having this moment of nostalgia where he's remembering back to this time when he was a kid, that before things got real serious and before like he had to worry about perfection, and he's just playing this parachute game where, you know, you're in gym class, you've got the color parachute, you're like, and you run into the parachute. I don't know, did y'all play with the parachute? I feel like that's kind of a universal American like elementary school experience. Like we all had that parachute. I don't know who makes them or where they came from, but they were all over elementary schools. And he's remembering back, and he has this metaphorical language, right? He's describing it. He uses some simile, right? You and all the rest of the kids get a hold of the spot and together lifted the parachute up and then down, trapping air under it, like catching a big empty cloud, right? Like catching a cloud, right? So another sort of lofty kind of comparison there, like catching a cloud in a parachute. What you really loved was when everyone lifted the parachute up again, releasing the air, and before the parachute floated down one by one, you all got a turn to run under its stained glass canopy. This is metaphorical language, right? It's not literally stained glass, right? It's just it's got like sort of a big pie of multicolored, different colored you know, sections of the parachute, right? It's like, I don't know, like 8 sections. It's like a big colorful pizza. But calling it a stained glass canopy, right? That's really interesting. Where do you see stained glass usually?
Big churches.
Churches, right? And not just churches, but also cathedrals, like places of worship, places of spiritual meditation. Again, using this like very lofty language to, you know, this memory is really, really important to him. There's a reason why he's showing us this. There's a reason why this moment is so important. And it's this moment of like, it's like a touchstone of spiritual reverence for him. And we can get to that through looking at the way that he's describing these things, like the way that he's using metaphors and similes. Couple other ones, analogy, like I said, all of these are kind of versions of an analogy. Analogy is just an extended comparison between things. A good example of the analogy is that second beating heart that Strayed talks about, how it starts off and it's just kind of a simile, then it becomes a metaphor, and then she just keeps coming back to it over and over again. So the hallmark of an analogy is that, literarily speaking, the writer just keeps coming back to those images and they keep defining different things in terms of those images. And finally, she pulls the beating heart out of her chest, right? And that's sort of the end of that analogy. So it's really more of like an extended meditation, employing like similes and metaphorical language. And, you know, often in an analogy, you'll find similes and metaphors. You'll probably find some descriptive language. You'll find appeals to different kinds of imagery. You might even find symbolism, right? The heart itself is a symbol, right? She's not literally pulling her heart out of her chest, right? The heart itself is a symbol for something greater than it is, right? The heart is a symbol of her, you know, perseverance, the consequence of her work, right? And then irony, I think the irony is the last one here. Irony is a literary device wherein statements or actions lead to the opposite of what is expected or intended. There's generally 3 kinds of irony, 2 of which are a lot more common than the third. Dramatic irony is really just more of an artificial kind of irony. I'll talk about that one in just a minute. Verbal irony is just saying one thing and meaning another, right? The most readily identifiable example of verbal irony is just using sarcasm, right? Saying one thing and literally meaning the opposite of what you're saying, right? Everybody knows verbal irony. I have whole relationships with people built on verbal irony. If you've ever been on any social media site, you know what verbal irony is. Everybody's being ironic on the internet. Situational irony, this occurs when actions lead to the opposite of what the actor intended. This is often the situation in romantic comedies. Oh no, the exact thing that I sought to head off is the exact thing that happened through the actions that I took, right? Situational comedies, right? Sitcoms, romantic comedies, these all traffic in situational irony. It's where the actions of the people involved, they aim at one thing and they produce exactly the thing that they were trying to not produce. And then dramatic irony, this occurs when characters lack information that we as the audience has. I haven't really seen any examples of this. Again, this is a more of a sort of a fictional literary device. It comes out of drama more than anything. When you're watching a play, Shakespeare traffics really heavily in dramatic irony. If you've ever read any of Sophocles, the Oedipus cycle, the play Oedipus Rex itself, highly dramatically ironic, right? It's dramatically ironic because you as the reader or the viewer of the thing, you have a little bit more information about what the stakes in the play that the actors don't have themselves, right? If I were to go and watch a Shakespearean play, you might not know these things, but I happen to have read a lot of Shakespeare. I would know some things that were going on before the play actually happened. And that was like the situation in Greek tragedy. People knew of the Oedipus myth before they watched Sophocles' play. Sophocles' play is just like based on an older story, right? They generally know, oh, I'm going to see Oedipus. That's the one with a guy has children with his mom. Really weird. That's highly dramatically ironic. We all know what's going to happen at the end of that, but it's painful to watch poor Oedipus try to play ancient Greek detective about what the pestilence affecting his land, and he's trying to get to the bottom of it. And the closer he gets to the truth, the more uncomfortable it becomes that Oedipus himself is the thing that is he is the guilty one. He is the reason why all the terrible things that are happening. Again, that's dramatic irony. I don't know if we're going to run into any dramatic irony, but whenever you read and learn about fiction in particular, you'll start to see more things about dramatic irony. We'll put off the patterns. I think that's quite enough about purpose today. We'll talk more about patterns next time when we talk about referential writing. We got about 10 minutes left, so I'll end on showing versus telling. So that's going to be a good lead into description. It kind of ties together some of the ideas that we talked about in expressive and literary writing. Oftentimes you will hear, especially if you ever get a creative writing class, that you need to show the characters doing things. You don't tell, show, right? And what does that mean? This is a paraphrase that's often attributed to Chekhov of gun fame. Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass, right? This is an exact, couldn't be more of a literal example of this, right? You can say the moon is shining, but if you describe there was broken glass on the ground of which the moon glinted off of, right? I know that I deductively know that the moon is shining, right? It's describing something instead of telling something outright. So, like I said, one of the most common pieces of writing is to show rather than tell. It's not necessarily wrong to tell. Showing is a little bit more literary of an action. Whenever you're engaged in referential writing, whenever you're engaged in argumentative writing, you're going to be doing a lot of telling, right? Your purpose is to inform. And if your purpose is to inform, then you tell. But if your purpose is a little bit more literary or expressive, you kind of want to show a little bit more than you tell, right? You're going to be mixing those purposes up a little bit more, right? When Cheryl Strayed tells you that writing is really hard, okay, she's telling you that. But if Cheryl Strayed says, I had to pull a beating heart from out of my chest and lay on the ground weeping, now she's showing you the process, right? She's showing you what the creative process is like, rather than just saying oh, writing is hard, right? Both of those are, might have the same cognitive meaning. They have very different emotional meanings, you could say. So showing is all about invoking a more emotional kind of writing. It means to illustrate your point through descriptive language. So using figurative language, using similes, using metaphors. Strayed is probably the most evocative example of showing. Oria is using a lot of telling in his narrative, right? He's showing you a little bit, right? But he's pretty thin on the figurative language. You could say he has, a scrawny sense of figurative language. Whereas Sedaris is using a little bit more robust figurative language, but even Sedaris is kind of more telling you narration. It's a little bit more straightforward telling than it is showing, except when we get to that ending point in Sedaris, when you've got this really, I think, evocative sense of showing whenever we get to the climactic moment, which is where his mom bursts in. My mother told the Tomke she needed to check on something, and then she opened the door and stuck her head inside my room. What the hell are you doing? She whispered, but my mouth was too full to answer. "I'll just be a moment," she called as she closed the door behind her and moved toward my bed. I began breaking the wax lips and candy necklaces pulled from pile number 2. These were the second best things I had received, and while it hurt to destroy them, it would have hurt even more to give them away. I had just started to mutilate the miniature box of Red Hots when my mother pried them from my hands, accidentally finishing the job for me. BB-sized pellets clattered to the floor as I followed them with my eyes. She snatched up a roll of Necco wafers. "Not those," I pleaded. But rather than words, my mouth expelled chocolate, chewed chocolate, which fell onto the sleeve of her sweater. "Not those, not those." She shook her arm and the mound of chocolate dropped like a horrible turd upon my bedspread. "You should look at yourself," she said. "I mean, really, just look at yourself." Right? Like this moment, right? He could tell you, like, what is he telling you in this moment when he's got the mouth full of chocolate and pleading, "Please don't take my candy," right? He's telling you that I'm being a little bit greedy. I'm being a little bit selfish. He's showing you that in the way that he's got his mouth is full of chocolate. He can't even think straight. He knows that even chocolate isn't good for him. He has a physical reaction against chocolate, and he's going against his better judgment because all of that's being overridden by the sense that he has of I just have to keep what's mine, right? I'm being miserly, you could say, with his candy. And that image of the chocolate dropped like a horrible turd. What beautiful descriptive language, right? Like how gross is that, right? And not only is that gross, it's almost like he is that disgusting in this moment. It's like a moment of self-analysis, but he's showing us that analysis, right? He even tells us in a minute that he can't even face this, right? While I was in trouble for not bringing my candy sooner, my sisters were in more trouble for not bringing it at all. We spent the early part of our evening in our rooms, and then one by one we eased our way back upstairs and joined our parents in front of the TV. I was the last to arrive and took a seat on the floor beside the sofa. The show was a Western, and even if my head had not been throbbing, I doubt I would have been able to had the wherewithal to follow it. I'm reading the wrong part. It's this part. For months now, I had protected and watched over these people, but now with one stupid act, they had turned my pity into something hard and ugly. The shift wasn't gradual, but immediate, and it provoked an uncomfortable feeling of loss. We hadn't been friends, the Tompkins and I, but I still had given them the gift of my curiosity. How arrogant. The gift of his curiosity. I gave you my attention, which is the greatest thing I have to give, right? I love how, like, just brutally honest Sedaris is about he's a child, right? Like how much self-awareness you really have. Wondering about the Tomke family had made me feel generous, but now I would have to shift gears and find pleasure in hating them. The only alternative was to do as my mother had instructed and take a good look at myself. This was an old trick designed to turn one's hatred inward, and while I was determined not to fall for it, it was hard to shake the mental picture snapped by her suggestion. Here is a boy sitting on a bed, his mouth smeared with chocolate. He's a human being, but he's also a pig, surrounded by trash and gorging himself so that others may be denied. Were this the only image in the world, you'd be forced to give your full attention. But fortunately, there were others. This stagecoach, for instance, coming around the bend with a cargo of gold, this shiny new Mustang convertible, this teenage girl, her hair a beautiful mane, sipping Pepsi through a straw, one picture after another, on and on until the news and whatever came after the news, right? Now the way that television is distracting becomes a coping mechanism so that he doesn't have to face hard and terrible truths about himself, right? And he's doing a little bit of showing and telling us here, but he shows us him being what he described and what the thing he can't face, a horrible pig who's surrounded by trash and gorging himself. It's a pretty harsh evaluation, one that he's only able to make now that he's writing. Notice all of this is in the past tense, right? He's writing as an adult, looking back, narrating a story told from the point of view of a child, right? He's able maybe to get to that emotional truth by the distance that sort of time gives you. And he's only seems to be aware of the idea of what he's showing you now that he's had the time to sort of think about that and really unpack those things. And so that he can show you that and tell you that at the same time, right? So it's doing a little bit of both. So it's not about not doing one or just doing the other. It's about really knowing when to do one and when to do the other. Telling can be vague and kind of generic, but it's not always bad, right? Sometimes you just need to say something in a straightforward way, but sometimes showing people things in an evocative, descriptive, imagery-laden way is a very also effective way of communicating something that has like a profound emotional content, right? That's a little bit more, again, especially when you're dealing with emotional qualities of things, right? I can tell you, oh, this experience was difficult. If I showed you the things being difficult, if I show you, right, the experience that I have, like in different scenes and vignettes, and you can see me engaging with conflict, engaging with obstacles and overcoming those obstacles, throwing a perfect game of pizza dough, coming to a recognition that I'm a horrible person slathered with chocolate on my mouth. Those showings can really support and buttress the act of telling in a way that telling itself can't always get to. So just again, like, it's all about intention, right? Whenever you're showing things, choosing evocative and specific details, creating enough context, using dialogue, using figurative language, and avoiding labeling specific emotions. If Sedaris would have said, I ate, it's one thing to say, like, even when he does, he said, oh, I hated them. There's a reason why he's turned to the telling there, but what am I getting at with, I was happy, right? That's going to mean different things to different people. The quality of everyone's happiness is a little bit different. You make a stronger emotional connection if you show the thing producing happiness and you sort of are describing this experience of happiness, right? And so much for expressive and literary writing. And so that brings us to a close today. I'll go ahead and stop our share and recording there, and we'll come back